For those of you listening who know me, you would also know that I'm not easily impressed. The world we live in seems to be one huge hype to me at times, and it leaves me constantly underwhelmed. I think we all recognise that, where the promise rarely meets our expectations. In my view, an exception to this has been noise suppression in both Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. And there's two main reasons for that. Firstly, it delivers exactly what the tool suggests, and in fact it meets all of my expectations. Secondly though, that success impacts in a positive way on so much of our photography. Noise suppression driven by artificial intelligence has moved the goalposts, or as I said recently, it's thrown all of my photographic balls in the air. Take photography in a dark rainforest as an example. If we were looking for good images, we would almost certainly have carried a tripod. We would be trying to keep the ISO to 100 and noise to an absolute minimum. But I did the unthinkable a few days ago because I went into the rainforest and I set my ISO to 1000 and beyond, and I handheld my Canon R5 with a 24-105 zoom. Now I'm not suggesting here that I'll never take a tripod into the rainforest again. I almost certainly will. However, due to the success of AI noise suppression, I'd like to know where the new boundaries are, and this subject was a great test. I'm also not suggesting that these images are National Geographic standard, but as images from what was primarily a walk in the forest rather than a photographic sortie, they're not bad at all. This bird stayed put long enough for me to consider swapping to my 80-200mm lens, and to maintain 125th of a second shutter speed, I had to increase the ISO to 3200. Now I'm sure you can see evidence of the noise in this image even on a YouTube video, and as yet no editing has been done to this image at all. If I zoom in just a little more, you can see the problem we face. Now let's edit this in Adobe Camera Raw. Here I'm going to begin with a crop. I'm going to click and drag just over the bird because I think we need to create a little bit of composition. We can lose the highlight down at the bottom right, but I want to retain the oblong shape of the image. I quite like that. Got a bit of a problem here, but we can easily deal with that later, even if we wanted to leave it in. But I think that doesn't look too bad. I'm going to hit the enter key and we'll begin our manipulations from here. And one of the things I think it needs is a little look at the color balance, because I'm shooting in shady conditions. If you look over on the right, you can see the temperature is down in the blue, and I think the magenta is a little bit high also. So selecting the eyedropper tool, which is generally my favourite method, except the times when it doesn't work too well, then I go back to manual. But it looks a little bit magenta in the part of the bird here. Let me just click and take a look, and I quite like what it's just done. I've got a bit more green coming through there now, and that's looking okay. Now I'd like to go to my auto setting here. I always give that a click and see exactly what it can do, and I generally use this as my starting point. I think it's made the whole thing rather too bright, so I'm going to drop down the exposure a little bit, looking carefully at the image. But I don't think I want to go too much further than that. You can see if you look at the histogram, I'm losing some of the dark content in the image, but I would suggest it's pretty minimal. But if I go to my blacks, I could back off a little bit if I felt it was appropriate. Now with this image, it's mainly the background that I need to darken. A couple of ways we can do that. We can do that using a radial mask, or we can select the background. Let's check. One way of doing this is to select the masks and see how well AI can select the background for us. Takes just a few seconds, as you can see here. But if we look carefully around the bird, apart from losing a little bit on the branch here, and maybe a little bit of the feather underneath the back, it's done a pretty good job, I think. So what I'm going to do here is drop the highlights down and drop the exposure a little bit. Now, one of the things I like about these tools is if I want to go a little bit further with this, say to that sort of point, but I don't want some of these real dark areas to go too black, that's when I choose to subtract using a brush. So what I can do here, if you look over to the right hand side at the flow, keep the flow down to about 20 or 30, maybe 20, and I can just wipe over these areas so I can just kill the worst of that darkness, because it doesn't tend to look quite right. Holding the space bar, just moving my picture to the right, just so I can get access to that top corner, but you get an idea of how easy this is to do. Now what I'd like to do here, I think, is a little bit of manual work, because I've got a light area here, 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 here. If I use graduated masks, I'm going to be forever removing the darkness from these shadows. So it may be a better thing here to go to this little cross and choose my brush. If I go down to the settings, what do I want to do? Well, I want to take the highlights down, but I don't think that's going to have a great effect. Mostly it's the exposure, so I'll drop it down a bit. Now I'm making the changes that I want to impart to the image before I've even started masking. So how do I know I've got these right? Well, I don't, is the honest answer, but with a little bit of experience you tend to get it right most of the time. But it really isn't a problem even if I don't get it right, because I can go back at any time and adjust these. But I like to use my brushes with the flow rate fairly low, so I can do things like this, and I can introduce the tonal changes just in the areas I think they're required. And you'll notice I usually spend quite a bit of time on corners and edges, because we're trying to avoid the people looking at our picture to be dragged to the edge and out of the image by light areas that we could quite easily deal with. Control 0 will fit the image back on screen. Just for a minute, I'm going to go back to my basic tab. Just take a look at maybe a little tweak of the vibrance. Now I've been looking at this for a little while, that looks okay. Maybe a little bit of clarity, not too much. But now I'm looking at the image, I still would like to do a little more work here and maybe here. Or what we could do is use AI fill to replace these areas in a few moments when we open this up into Photoshop. I've got a couple of little distractions around the image which I would probably deal with either in Photoshop, but we can give them a try now. Little highlights on the woodwork here, they're not big deals, but I tend to select the right tool, and here I'm going to select the Content Aware Remove, adjust the size of the brush, give a little touch, and see if I can actually remove these little tiny distractions. I think I get the feeling sometimes that when people are watching my videos, they think I'm probably going a little too far with these things, but distractions are those sorts of things where individually they're not important. But when we see the image, when we've dealt with lots of these distractions, we can see a distinct difference, and not working quite so well on the edge there, but they're not too bad, I would suggest. It was those light ones that I didn't like too much, those that stood out against the darkness. So we could go on and do more work on this, but I think the important thing now is to go back to the basic tab, and we're going to take a look at dealing with the noise. Now we find that in the detail section. I can't believe how quick and easy this is to do. I'm going to click the denoise and we'll get the little panel arrive very shortly. I can move the panel around. I can click on the bird so I can look at a particular point. Let's have a look over the back there. Well, maybe the front might be better. Let's have a look at that, because there we can see the background. So when I click, I get a before and an after. Now it's doing a magnificent job already, but I've got a setting here of 48. Normally the default's around 50. So with this image, and because we're trying to deal with the noise really effectively, I'm going to push that up to about 70 plus. Click and release so I can see. I don't like to go so far that I make these things too smooth and they almost look unnatural. But if I was to click and release and we concentrate on the fine hairs here, this is what's sold me on this AI noise suppression, how it's so effective at dealing with the noise but leaves all the fine detail intact. I'm going to click Enhance, and what Photoshop's doing now, it's creating a duplicate, a DNG file, which still remains raw, of course. You can see it on the right hand side. It's going to take a little while with this sort of image, particularly because I suppose there's quite a bit of noise here, and also I've done a fair bit of work. So I'm going to come back when this is done. As soon as the noise suppression completed, I've opened this up into Photoshop. Now I mentioned just a few moments ago we've got a little bit of a light area on the left and the right. Nothing we couldn't deal with in Camera Raw, nothing we couldn't deal with the burn tool here in Photoshop. But let's go to the selection tool here, the lasso. Just make a quick lasso shape around there. Missed a bit there, so I'll add that little bit in. Going to go up to the generative field, put my cursor in the box and hit the enter key. I want to see just how Photoshop will deal with that highlight, because I think it's probably going to do a pretty good job. Just taking a few moments to do that. Looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go down to the right hand side and I'm going to do exactly the same here. Click and enter, and I'll allow this to go in real time. Now what I may do with this image is, because if I was watching this video myself, I would like to be able to open up this image, the original that you're looking at here, on my own computer, and I'd like to be able to zoom in. So I'm going to make this image available to you. In the details below, you'll find a link to this image just as it is here. Now I'm not going to go any further with this. I'm going to go to my layers. There you can see the two repairs we've done. Both of them have been done on new layers, so we never burn our boats doing this work. We can back away anytime it doesn't work, but I'm reasonably happy with that, so I'm going to flatten the image to finish. I've noticed a little bit of lightness down here and down at the bottom left corner, but I'm sure I could deal with that with just a quick touch of the healing brush. So as I said just a few moments ago, I will produce this image for you to download and take a look at yourself. But just to bring this video to a close, I've got my zoom tool selected. I'll click, still looks pretty good. I'll click, still looks pretty good. I'm looking for noise in the background, anything which may detract from the image. So let's go in again. We're up to 50% and we're still looking pretty good. A little bit of softness in the beak, but of course that's depth of field where the bird is looking very slightly away from me. Had the bird turned its head slightly towards me, this would have been sharp, but I could have achieved that with a slightly smaller aperture. But again, I'm shooting with a 200mm at I think it was 125th of a second. Maybe I could have gone down lower than that given the image stabilization in the Canon R5. But again, we'll click again and again to take us up to 100%, and we can see that we still seem to have retained pretty good quality in this image. Now, as we take a look at this finished image, and with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps I could have increased the ISO even a little more to allow the f4 aperture to be reduced to f5.6. If I wanted to go even lower to, let's say, f8, then I'd probably have to drop my shutter speed to about a 60th of a second. Would I have got the same results or better results with those settings? Well, that's difficult to say with any certainty. But I'm definitely closer now to knowing exactly where my boundaries are with the Canon R5 and AI noise suppression. I wonder sometimes if I'm getting a little bit overexcited about this noise suppression. Are you as impressed as I am? I'll see you next time.